going to cover pump motor rebuild. With the proper tools and setup, most Autoclor branches and individuals should be able to tackle this project with no problem. For those branches that are sending out their motors for repair to another facility, this video could help in becoming more independent, relying less on someone else to repair your motors for you, thus shortening the turnaround time to get a bad motor back into the field. We will cover the most common repair issues that happen on the Autoclor 1 horsepower pump motor, mainly repairing water leaks that come from the seals and minor electrical issues. We will not be covering replacements of bearings or internal electrical components, as these projects take on a higher level of knowledge and specialized tools needed to complete those tasks. We can cover bearing replacements in another video if the need is there for one. Proper tools and setup are essential in getting any job done well. Here I'll go over all the tools needed to rebuild pump motor. You're going to want to start off with your PPE supplies, some nitrile gloves for hand protection, and of course your eye protection. Do recommend having some cleaning supplies handy. Express degreaser does a great job, along with a couple of wire brushes. You will need a few hand tools. A good 14-inch pipe wrench comes in handy, along with a 9/16 combination wrench, screwdriver, pair of needle nose pliers, and a rubber mallet. You will also need a 13/16 deep socket. This will come in handy for driving in those water seals. And you also want to have the S131 seal press tool. There are a few electrical tools that you'll need for testing. A voltmeter and a line splitter comes in very handy, along with the GFCI adapter. Power drill with a wire brush, can of spray paint, also a couple of adjustable clamps. These help really tighten that motor onto the pump motor vise and keep it in place. You're also going to need the pump motor vise available from Autoclor, along with the bit that's sold separately. And finally, your power cord. This one's set up with push-on terminals for convenience. Also an on-off switch. Feel that makes it a little bit safer than just having a straight power cord. We're going to start off the motor rebuild by doing an inspection. This particular motor has a ticket assigned to it. I think this is a good practice branches should do. It puts a reasoning on why somebody brought that motor back in place, so it helps you kind of get started. Here I'm just checking the impeller, making sure that it's spinning around good, that nothing's binding. And also taking a look at the wires in the back, making sure that insulation plate is in place and you don't have any burnt or loose wires. Next, we're going to prepare to test the motor by hooking it up to a power source. We're going to use our power cord with the terminals on one end. And again, this is the power cord that's got the on and off switch on it. I'm going to start off by removing the ground screw. And attaching the ground wire from the power cord. This just helps ensure a little bit higher safety margin when you're running the electrical system. always like to take a look at these terminals, give them a little crimp, just to make sure you got a nice tight fitting when you do put it on the motor. And you're going to have a fitting on the top and the bottom of that insulation board, and that's where your two wires are going to go. Then you're going to take your motor and slide it onto that pump motor vise. Just a little bit. You're not going to lock it in, but you just don't want it to walk away from you when you turn it on. Another thing we're going to take a look at is the actual motor plate. And so you see here that these motors can be rated as high voltage and low voltage. We want to make sure that these wires are hooked up in the low voltage in that configuration. We'll also take a look at the volts that are required and then how that corresponds with the amp specs. So at 115 amps, we're going to be looking for somewhere around 12.2 amps. Normally 11 to 14 range is acceptable for these motors. This is the equipment you're going to need to hook up the power source side to your motor. You want a GFCI adapter, this X-Tech line splitter, and a voltmeter that has the capability to amp test. You're going to set that to 40 amps. This is what the setup's going to look like when you're ready to start testing. Now that we have our motor hooked up to our power source, we're going to test it. As you can see here, turning it on and off, the motor does not run. We can verify with our amp meter we are getting an open line, so we have an electrical issue. A bad capacitor can keep a motor from starting, so we're going to replace it and see what happens. First, I'm going to take off the capacitor cover. You'll see that two wires are attaching to the two sets of posts. I'm going to grab a new capacitor and just reattach those two wires, one to each set of posts. Now we're going to reinstall the cover and make sure everything is secure. It's a good practice to replace the capacitor on all your motor rebuilds. Just adds an extra layer of insurance that you'll have a good motor for quite some time. Now we are ready to retest the motor. We have our electrical supply all hooked up. We're going to turn on the switch and see that the motor runs, and we are now within the proper amp range for this motor. Now that we are confident that the motor works well electronically, we're going to disassemble the motor. You're going to look for this shaft on the back side, has a notch in it. You're going to line that up with the bit that is attached to the pump motor vise. You're going to want to get those to match in place and get that shaft where it's locked in and it will not rotate. Then you're going to grab your adjustable clamps and tie those down to that vise in the motor. Now that you've got your motor in place, nice and snug, grab your 14-inch pipe wrench and you're going to grab the outside of that impeller. One thing you want to avoid is using a screwdriver to try to remove that impeller. Do not put it into those slots. It will cause damage. mainly around the edges. The metal is pretty thin right there, and it will cause it to get off balance. So you definitely want to use your pipe wrench on the outside and get a good bite on it. And with just a slight bit of force, you should be able to get that impeller to come off. This is an area where you could use that rubber mallet to help loosen up that impeller. Otherwise, it should spin right off. Now that we have the impeller off, we're going to disassemble the pump bracket. There are going to be 4 bolts attaching the pump bracket to the motor. This is where you're going to use your 9/16 combination wrench and disassemble the 4 bolts. After you have your 4 bolts removed, you want to take your rubber mallet and hit that pump bracket. You should be able to give it a few knocks and it should come right off. As you take that pump bracket off, you'll see that the outer seal and the springs will come off, but you will still have the inner seal attached. You do want to make sure you have your eye protection on during this time as we get prepared to refurbish the pump motor bracket. With the pump bracket turned upside down, you can come from the back side and remove the inner pump seal. You do want to make sure that it comes out in one piece. There is a rubber section along with the ceramic part. Using the drill and wire brush, we're going to remove as much rust as possible around your pump bracket. You're going to want to get inside, especially where the seals are, and get as much rust and debris out of there as possible. You're also going to want to make sure you go around your gasket area, remove the old O-ring and any remnants of the paper gasket that was left behind. When you're done with your wire brush cleaning, just give it a good wipe down with the rag. Get any loose rust, debris out of the area. This is what a refurbished pump bracket should look like. Pay attention to that inner seal. You really want it to be rust-free and very sharp on the edges. Now we can start to seat the new inner seal. Like I said before, you really want to pay attention to that seating area. Now you want to get your seal bearing kit. Open up the package. And as you open it up, try to keep it all assembled as it was packaged. There will be a piece of cardboard for shipping that needs to be tossed. Otherwise, you'll have your inner seal, your outer seal, and your spring assembly. Try to keep those in the same order that came out of the package so that you don't get things mixed up. Next, we're going to install the inner seal. It helps to put a little bit of tube lube around the outside of that seal. This will help facilitate the installation process and help seat that seal as good as possible. You're going to want to use the seat sealing tool, S131. Give it a couple of taps. Check to make sure any of the rubber gasket has not pulled away from the ceramic seal. Take a look on the other side and make sure everything is nice and tight. You do not want to see any gaps or pieces of rubber sticking out from the seal. Now's the time we're going to clean up the pump motor. Get yourself some Express degreaser. Spray that pump motor down. Let it soak in for some time. give it a good wipe over. Basically, you want to prep this motor so we can paint it in the future. During the cleaning process, we're going to want to pay a lot of attention to the pump motor vent areas. Clogged vents will overheat a motor and shorten its life. A small screwdriver comes in handy here. But you want to go through each one of these vent areas and get all the dust bunnies out of there and get this area as open and as clean as possible. Also, a wire brush will help remove any excess debris that's still in there. Now that we have the motor all cleaned, we're going to give it a refresh paint job. This is a good indicator to everyone else in the branch that the motor has been rebuilt and is ready to go back out into the field. Do try to protect your motor plate so that you can read it in the future if you need to. The next step is to install the pump bracket. You do want to be careful as you are sliding over the pump bracket that you do not knock out your seal when you are sliding it over the pump shaft. After you've done that, get your 9/16 bolts and reinstall them into the 4 holes that attach to the pump motor. Next, you want to get your outer seal from your kit. The smaller section of the seal is going to go outward. Also adding a little bit of tube lube to the seal will help in the installation process. You're going to want to take that outer seal and slide it over the pump motor shaft. Then take your seal press tool and it will slide over the motor shaft, and that will push in the seal and bottom it out. Finally, you are going to want to take that 13/16 deep socket and sit it over the outer seal and hit it a couple of times with that rubber mallet. That will ensure a good tight seal. Now that we have all our seals in place, we can install the spring assembly. Spring assembly is pretty straightforward. Got your main spring and your little cap. This is where we're also going to put the impeller on. First start by sliding the spring on, then the spring cap, And finally, you can install the impeller. Just want to make sure that it's properly orientated when you slide it back on. You can start it by hand to start tightening it up. After you've locked your motor back into that pump motor vise, you can take your pipe wrench, put it on the outside of that impeller, and snugly tighten it. Need about 10 to 15 pounds of pressure is all it takes, and you'll be good to go. Now that your motor is pretty much reassembled, you can install your O-ring and gasket. Gasket should go on first, and then your O-ring. And then at this point, your motor is pretty much ready to go back out into the field. An additional step you can do for your motor before sending it into the field is to do a water test leak on it. This process will test for static water pressure, not running the motor under power. This test is pretty simple, and most branches should be able to test their motors in this fashion. Get your water supply and attach it to the pump motor. Turn on your water source. Look for leaks around any of your gasket areas or your seals. If you have no leaks, your motor is good to go, and you can be pretty confident that you will have a good motor going back out into the field.